Once upon a time, in the heart of rural Africa, lay the village of Uyo. Uyo was located between hills and beneath the skies painted with the colors of dawn and dusk. The village was small, but its soul was vast, filled with the ancient songs of the rivers and the whispered prayers of its people. Life moved at a gentle pace in Uyo. Farmers tilled the rich dark soil, herdsmen guided their cattle along the river banks, and the women tended to their homes, their laughter a melody that wove through the village like a sweet refrain. The villagers lived simply, but they were content. They believed in the old ways, in the power of the land, and the spirits of their ancestors. Yet beneath this tranquil surface, there lingered a quiet yearning. For several years, the people of Uyo had prayed for miracles, healing for the sick, children for the barren, and prosperity for all. Their faith was strong, but their patience was wearing thin. It was into this atmosphere of hope and desperation that a man named Pastor Chase Mensah arrived. Pastor Chase appeared in Uyo one sunny afternoon, his arrival as unexpected as a gust of wind on a still day. He was a striking figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with skin the color of polished mahogany and eyes that glinted with a knowing light. He dressed impeccably, always in tailored suits that contrasted sharply with the humble attire of the villagers. But it was his voice, deep and resonant, that truly captivated the people. When he spoke, it was as though the earth itself paused to listen. "The Lord has sent me to this village," he proclaimed on his first day in the village square. "I am here to deliver you from your troubles, to bring you the miracles you have been praying for." The villagers, at first wary of this stranger, soon found themselves drawn to him. He spoke of visions and dreams, of supernatural powers granted to him by the heavens, and in a village where hope was as precious as water in a drought, his words were like rain to parched soil. But there was a peculiar condition to his miracles. Pastor Chase claimed that his powers only worked on women. "The Spirit moves through the hearts of women," he would say with a smile. "They are the vessels of God's grace." And so, the women of Uyo, from the youngest maiden to the eldest grandmother, flocked to his side. His modest church, a simple structure with a thatched roof and wooden benches, quickly became the beating heart of the village. What began as Sunday services soon transformed into daily gatherings, as the women abandoned their chores and their families to sit at the feet of this charismatic pastor. The men of the village watched this unfolding spectacle with a mixture of confusion and concern. They could not deny the changes they saw in their wives, how their eyes sparkled with newfound devotion, how they whispered fervent prayers even as they cooked and cleaned. But they dared not question the pastor's influence, for fear of being labeled as either faithless or, even worse, cursed by their wives. As time passed, Pastor Chase's influence only deepened. The women of Uyo became enraptured, not just by his sermons, but by the man himself. His presence was magnetic, his every word laced with promises of divine favor, and he knew exactly how to play with their desires. Izzy, a woman in her early 30s who had been married for 10 years without bearing a child, was one of Pastor Chase's most devoted followers. She had tried everything possible: traditional healers, prayers, and even secret rituals, but still her womb remained empty. When Pastor Chase promised her a child, she clung to his words like a lifeline. "You will bear a son," he told her, his hand pointing to her. "But you must have faith, and faith requires sacrifice." Izzy's heart leapt with hope. She sold her family's most prized possession, a small plot of land that had been in her husband's family for generations, and gave the money to Pastor Chase. "It is for the work of God," she told herself. "It is for my future." Abena, another devoted follower, had been married to Obinna for 15 years. Their marriage had grown cold, with Obinna spending more time in the fields than at home. When Pastor Chase told her she was special, chosen by God for a higher purpose, she believed him. His compliments, his lingering glances, they made her feel alive in a way she had not felt in years. She began to spend all her time at the church, convinced that the pastor held the key to her happiness. But as the women grew more devoted, the men grew more distant. Obinna in particular noticed the change in his wife. She no longer smiled at him the way she used to. Her mind seemed to be elsewhere, always at the church, always with the pastor. One evening, as they sat by the fire having a conversation, Obinna, who could no longer pretend to not see what had been going on, finally voiced his concerns. "Abena, why are you giving all our money to this pastor? We can barely afford to feed ourselves." Abena looked at him with a mixture of pity and impatience. "You wouldn't understand," she said. "Pastor Chase is a man of God. He has promised to bless our family." Obinna sighed, his frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. "I don't doubt your faith, Abena, but no true man of God would demand so much money from his followers." But Abena wouldn't listen. She was too deeply under the pastor's spell. What the villagers did not know was that Pastor Chase had a dark past, one that he had kept hidden beneath his polished exterior. Before he arrived in Uyo and playing his tricks on the likes of Abena and Eze, he had been a con artist in the city, preying on the vulnerable and desperate. He had mastered the art of manipulation, learning how to read people's desires and exploiting their weaknesses. And when the law caught up with him, he fled to the countryside, reinventing himself as a man of God. He knew that in a village like Uyo, people like Eze and Abena were looking for hope, for something to believe in, and he provided just that, a promise of miracles. But his power only worked on women because it was easier to manipulate them with his charm. He knew that women, especially those who felt neglected or unappreciated, would be drawn to his charisma. He could make them feel seen, heard and valued, and in return, they would give him anything he asked for: money, gifts, and even their loyalty. As Pastor Chase's influence grew, so did his demands. He began asking for larger and larger sums of money, claiming that God required sacrifices for the miracles to manifest. "Faith without works is dead," he would say. "If you truly believe, you must give generously." And the women, convinced of his powers, began to empty their savings, selling their jewelry, and in some cases, stealing from their husbands. But Pastor Chase was not content with just material wealth. He craved power over the hearts and mind of the people. And so, he began to push the boundaries of his influence, convincing the women that their devotion to him was more important than their duties to their families. The men of the village grew increasingly uneasy and had a meeting under the baobab tree in the village square. They noticed how their wives had changed, how they spent all their time at the church, how they were giving away money and possessions, and how they seemed to be under some kind of spell. The men didn't understand how a pastor's powers could only work on women, and they started to feel uneasy. The first seeds of doubt were planted when Eze's promised miracle failed to materialize. Months passed, and still, her womb remained barren. She tried to push the doubts from her mind, but they crept in like shadows at dusk. Every time she questioned her faith, Pastor Chase was there with sweet words and reassurances. "Patience, my child," he would say. "The Lord works in mysterious ways." But the doubts persisted, gnawing at her soul like termites in wood. She began to notice things, small things, but unsettling nonetheless. The way Pastor Chase would linger in the company of certain women, the way his eyes would roam during sermons, the way he always seemed to have just the right words to say, as though he could read minds. Eze wasn't the only one who began to have doubts. Other women in the village started to whisper among themselves, sharing stories of promised miracles that had yet to come. And yet, they felt trapped, too ashamed to admit that they had been deceived, too afraid of what would happen if they questioned the pastor's authority. The men too were growing restless. Obinna in particular was determined to uncover the truth. He began to ask some of the women questions, discreetly at first, but more boldly as time went on. He spoke to other men in the village, sharing his concerns and gathering their stories. Slowly, a picture began to emerge, a picture of a man who was not what he seemed. But Obinna knew that confronting the pastor directly could be dangerous. He needed proof, solid, undeniable proof that Pastor Chase was a fraud. The breaking point came one night when Eze, driven to desperation, confronted Pastor Chase during a service. The church was packed with women, their faces glowing with devotion as the pastor led them in a prayer. The prayers eventually came to an end and everyone took their seats. But Eze could no longer keep silent. She stood up in the middle of the service, her voice trembling with emotion. "Pastor Chase," she called out, interrupting the service. "You promised me a child. You said God would bless me. But it's been months, and still I'm barren. Why has God forsaken me?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Eze, who stood trembling before the pastor. Pastor Chase's face remained calm, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something dark. "My child," he said softly, "faith requires patience. Do not doubt the Lord's plan for you." "But I've given everything," Eze cried, her voice breaking. "I sold my family's land. I have nothing left. How much more must I sacrifice?" Pastor Chase's gaze hardened. "You must trust in God's will," he said coldly. "Perhaps your lack of faith is the reason for your barrenness." Eze recalled as though she had been struck. The other women in the church began to murmur, some looking at her with pity, others with disdain. But in that moment, something inside Eze snapped. She realized, with a clarity that cut through her like a knife, that she had been deceived. "You are no man of God," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "You are a liar and a thief." The pastor's face darkened. "Silence!" he thundered. "How dare you speak against the Lord's anointed?" But it was too late. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it spread like wildfire through the room. The women began to murmur louder, their eyes shifting between Eze and the pastor. The air was thick with tension, and Pastor Chase could feel his grip on the congregation slipping. Desperate to regain control, he raised his hands and began to pray loudly, invoking the wrath of God upon Eze for her insolence. But instead of silencing the crowd, his words only fueled their doubts. The women, once so devoted, now looked at him with suspicion and fear. It was then that Obinna, who had been watching from the back of the church, stepped forward. "Enough," he said, his voice steady and calm. "It is time the truth was revealed." As Obinna stepped forward, the church door creaked open, and a gust of wind swept through the room. The women gasped, and Pastor Chase's eyes darted to the floor, where a shadowy figure stood in the doorway. The figure stepped into the light, revealing an elderly man with a weathered face and piercing eyes. He walked with a cane, but there was a strength in his posture that belied his age. The room fell silent as he made his way to the front of the church, his footsteps echoing off the wooden floor. "I am Osei," the man said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "I have come to expose the truth about this man who calls himself a pastor." Pastor Chase stiffened, but he quickly composed himself. "Who are you to challenge the Lord's anointed?" he sneered. Osei met his gaze without flinching. "I am the one who knows your true name, Chase Mensah. I know where you came from, and I know what you did." The room buzzed with whispers. The women exchanged glances, their faith in the pastor crumbling with each word. "You see," Osei continued, "this man, Chase Mensah, was a con artist in the city, a man who preyed on the vulnerable and the desperate. He promised them miracles, just as he has promised you, but all he did was to take their money and their hope. When the law caught up with him, he fled, leaving behind a trail of broken lives." The color drained from Pastor Chase's face, but he tried to maintain his composure. "Lies," he spat. "This old man speaks lies." But Osei was undeterred. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This is a warrant for your arrest, issued by the authorities in the city. Your past has finally caught up with you, Chase Mensah." The room erupted into chaos. The women who had adored the pastor now turned on him, shouting accusations and demanding for their money back. In the last ditch of effort to save himself, Pastor Chase dropped to his knees and begged for mercy. "I was wrong," he cried. "I was tempted by the devil. Please forgive me." But there was no forgiveness to be found. The women, now united in their anger, dragged him out of the church and handed him over to the authorities. The pastor's fall from grace was swift and merciless. In the days that followed, the village of Uyo was a place of mourning and reflection. The women, now free from the pastor's influence, were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Many had lost everything: their money, their homes, their marriages. The shame of being deceived weighed heavily on them. Eze, in particular, struggled to come to terms with what had happened. She had been so desperate for a child that she allowed herself to be blinded by false promises. But as the days passed, she found strength in the other women of the village. Together, they began to rebuild their lives, sharing their stories and supporting one another. The men too learned valuable lessons. They had been too passive, too willing to let their wives handle everything. They realized that they needed to be more involved in their family's spiritual and emotional well-being. Obinna, in particular, made a vow to be a better husband and father, to protect his family from harm. In time, the village healed. The church, once a place of deception, was transformed into a place of true worship and community. The women found strength in their faith, not in a man, but in themselves and in each other. As for Pastor Chase, he was taken away by the authorities, never to be seen again. But in Uyo, his name became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of blind faith and the importance of trusting in oneself. Thanks for watching this video. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel for more interesting stories like this. Catch you in the next video.